Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. I'm Dale Rude. Today we will be looking at part 10 of our episode series, Unraveling the Revelation. I would like to make a few comments based on some feedback that I've received, and I appreciate all the feedback. Throughout this presentation, there'll be some topics that I'll touch upon, and I'm not going to go in depth with those. My hope is that you will do your own research and validate or disvalidate what I have said. Everything in here, to the best of my knowledge, is correct, and I've tried to use the references in the text so you can see those and go back and visit those. So I do appreciate, and I do appreciate your interest. I can't go into every little detail. So there'll be some topics, again, that I'll introduce to you. I'll make a few statements and I have to move on to the next. Otherwise, this would be a very long series. We're already to part 10 and I'm probably only about halfway through. So I don't know how long this is going to be, but anyways, again, bear with me. If you have follow-up questions, send a comment or send an email. My email address for this podcast is... I almost forgot it here. Responding to, and that's T-O, religiousramblings@gmail.com. You can see that actually on the front page. So if you scroll back into YouTube here and go to the opening, you actually see that email address there. So if you have anything to share, pro, good, con, good, bad, pro, con, please do so. I welcome any comments, including constructive criticism. The second thing is, I do apologize about yesterday's episode. It went for about 50 some minutes. I'm hoping to keep these things down to about 30 minutes, but it just wasn't possible. And today is probably going to be the same way. So feel free to stop the podcast and come back and visit it later on. That's a good way to do it if you don't have that length of time to just sit and watch the whole episode. That's a good way. That's fortunately, because of YouTube, you can actually pause these things and come back at your convenience. So again, if you're with us at this point, you probably have an interest in this subject, and I appreciate you. Appreciate all your feedback and appreciate your time. Unraveling the Revelation, Part 10. We mentioned Brother Warner some time ago, and the various calculations and the interest that he had in prophecy. I found a quote just recently, and it's there in the text, April 27th of the Gospel Trumpet, 1893. And I wanted to read that to you, and then I'm going to visit the chart I put together right there at the top. So someone had written into the Gospel Trumpet, and they asked the question, they said, please explain Revelation 5, 1 through 3. The article is pretty lengthy. Again, I encourage you to go to the Nicholson Library archives, and you can obtain your own copies, digital copies of the Gospel Trumpet, so you can check all of these quotes that's in there, or if I'm only using snippets, you can go back and get the entire article and read it and study it for yourself. So with that being said, let me just read a little bit of what Brother Warner wrote in response to the question. He said, 7 denotes the complete number. It is used to denote a complete round of time, as in 7 days a week, and the 7 Sabbath years or weeks of years and so forth. In the above 7 seals, as seen in their opening in Revelation 6, we see 7 great epics or varied stages in the history of God's church, or the progress of salvation extending from the beginning of the kingdom of God on earth to the coming of Christ and the day of judgment. Now, that was written by D.S. Warner. So here we get an indication of where he may have been thinking with regard to church ages or epochs of time. And that is, he specifically says that there are 7 great epochs that are through our various stages of the church's history, starting with the beginning of the kingdom of God on earth to the second coming of Christ and the day of judgment. So that kind of sounds like he believed in the concept of 7 church ages, or 7 epochs of, certainly 7 epochs of time. Okay, so he made reference in this early on in his writing there to a previous article, and that article is found in the March 2nd, 1893. You can see that on page 1. The article is titled The 1,000 Years Reign. And I read that article with interest, and I tried to break it down with regard to what Brother Warner was saying regarding each church epoch or each great epoch of time. So the first one he referred to as the primitive apostolic church. And specifically, he mentioned the morning of light. That seems to be consistent with most 7 seal writers today. The second seal, he talked about the red horse of pagan Rome. And we see that symbol on the 7 seal charts as well. Now, it gets a little different here. In the third seal, he talks about the rise of apostasy. So he kind of separated the red horse from the rise of apostasy. And then in the fourth seal, he makes reference to the papal beast. So that is a little different than what is being taught today among the 7 seal advocates. The fifth seal, then, he talked about the period of stagnation in which the persecution against Christians was slowing down. He talked about church formality and martyrs under the altar. Now, this sounds an awful lot like the Protestant Reformation movement, in which we still hold as being a part of the fifth seal. So some similarities there, but he didn't actually come out and talk about Protestant specifically. And then in the sixth seal, he refers to the evening light and also a great earthquake that was to take place. Now, interestingly enough, in this particular article, nothing was said about the seventh seal. It wasn't even mentioned. So there was nothing there. And you know, people have speculated that might be because, you know, he was in the sixth seal. He couldn't see further ahead what was going to happen in the seventh seal. Whatever the reason may have been, there was nothing said about the seventh seal. And so up until the time I found this article, I had never heard Brother Warner lay this out like this. Typically, what I have seen are the 4 church ages, the early morning light, the dark ages, the dark and cloudy day of Protestantism, and then the evening light. But here he took it one more level and broke it down into 7 epochs. Now, so this was all new. In that same article there, in March the 2nd, 1893, and I do want to address this because I do have something to say. He specifically says here, in referring to the stars that fell, he says, another falling of the stars, the many holiness evangelists and editors that dropped from their plane of holiness when they rejected the evening light in the last 12 years. So what he was saying was the body of people that he used to belong to at one time, and then they required you to be associated with a denomination or a sect. He now said that the leaders, the people that also have competing papers with the gospel trumpet, he said because they rejected this light that he was now advancing and had been advancing for the last 12 years, they had rejected it, and now they were falling stars. In other words, they were fallen ministers. And this is something that troubles me, because I see this also in later on in our study today. I see the same kind of attitude towards that Brother Goodnight used towards people that didn't accept his version of the seven seals. I remember one time I was corresponding with a man. He was a pastor, and he had a different belief than what I did along a particular doctrinal line. And so what he did was he went to What the Bible Teaches by F.G. Smith, and he Xeroxed a few pages and mailed them to me. And he put a note at the bottom of his little Xerox copies. He said, "Now that you have seen this and you've had opportunity to believe this, if you reject this, I fear that hellfire is your destiny." And I'm like, are you kidding? Is this for real? You actually think that reading Xerox pages from a book that a man wrote that was a good man, sharing his understanding, somehow you believe if I don't embrace that, which happens to be the position that you hold, then I'm going to hell? That's ridiculous. None of us can walk in the light of another person. We have to walk in the light that we have. That's where we get into problems is when we take on behavioral practices or doctrines of other people as our own when we don't have real convictions. And so what we should be doing is asking God to enlighten us personally, individually, as to what he wants us to know. And so that attitude right there is troubling, and it's not the only place that we find that. I just wanted to share that because, again, this has been my journey on this particular subject. I'm not here to persuade you of anything. I'm just sharing you my journey and where I'm at. You can reject all of this. We'd still be brothers in the Lord. It doesn't bother me at all. And so I just want you to know, I'm not here to try to convince you of anything different than you already believe. I'm just sharing information with you, and then you have to do with it whatever you want to do. If God doesn't reveal this to you, or which he may not, if he doesn't, don't worry about it. We're still going to be friends at the end of the day. Okay, now, F.G. Smith, I just mentioned him. Oh, by the way, I did tell that brother in my response to him, I said, now, which specific version of what the Bible teaches did you Xerox? Because Brother Smith, received more understanding as time went on. And if you read his later books on that same subject, they're going to be much different than the one that you Xeroxed. So, again, pointing out the fact that we can't walk in another person's light. But F.G. Smith here, I'm going to quote him on the 7 church ages. This first quote can be found in his book called Prophetic Lectures on Daniel and the Revelation on page 23. This is what he had to say. With reference to the 7 churches of Asia, F.G. Smith writes, and I'm going to quote now, "These churches can scarcely be symbols of chronological epochs for the reason that they are themselves the object of symbolization. We know that type and antitype cannot be united in the same things, that they are mutually exclusive. And I fail to see how a particular church can be a direct object of symbolization and at the same time a symbol of something else. The 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches." Okay, what he was basically saying here was, rather than viewing the churches in Revelation, the 2nd chapter and the 3rd chapters, as being sequential epochs of time, what they held back in those days in the early 6th seal, most of them, at least after, maybe even including Warner, I'm not sure. What they held was that any of those conditions in those 7 churches can exist at any point in time. They can exist in a person's individual life, they can exist in a congregation, or they can exist at a particular church age. So they were not prophecy of what was going to happen sequentially as time went on. So I hope you understand what he was saying there. He said these things themselves are a symbol of something else, and so they can't. A church can't represent a church age. These church can't represent a church age because that's not type and antitype. Okay, let me read another one here. This is in the Revelation Explained. Now, this is the 1943 edition. Smith further writes, quote, "Some have assumed that the seven were selected in order to set forth seven successive historical epochs of the Christian church. The records show, however, that instead of the seven being symbols, they are themselves the objects of symbolization. Furthermore, the actual facts of ecclesiastical history in their successive order of unfolding do not agree with the messages as given to these churches." So what he was saying here, again, like he just said earlier, is that these churches, the conditions that was happening within each individual church, in history, and history has shown that they did not represent what was happening at that time. And I don't want to, I don't want to bring out a message here, but when we set forth, for instance, the seventh seal and the seven church age of Laodicea, and we say, well, it's been prophesied that this is going to be a lukewarm age. This is just the way it's going to be. What that does, it encourages people to think that we're going to be lukewarm, and therefore it's okay to be lukewarm. Or maybe if it's not okay, we might as well realize that that's just the age we live in. So he was saying, in these last days, we can be like the Philadelphia church. We can be like them. We don't have to be like one of the churches that had, specific issues. So that was what he was saying. Now that is a lot different than what is being taught in the seventh seal churches. Okay, next person I want to introduce you to, and you probably all heard about this man, the Scofield Bible, for instance. This is Cyrus Ingerson Scofield. He was born in 1843 and died in 1921. He was an American theologian, a minister, and a writer whose best-selling annotated Bible popularized futurism and dispensationalism among fundamentalist Christians. Scofield believed that between creation and the final judgment, there are seven distinct eras of God's dealing with man, and that those eras are a framework around which the message of the Bible can be explained. So basically he was saying from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, until Christ's coming, there are seven distinct eras on which God deals with man, and they're found throughout Scripture. He also divided the seven church letters into seven church ages and assigned specific dates to them. And again, the Scofield Bible is widely circulated Bible. It first appeared in 1909 and was revised by the author in 1917. Take note of those years. It came out in 1909. It's a dispensationalist Bible. It talks about seven church ages sequentially, and it was also revised in 1917. I know that in the congregation I grew up, it was very much discouraged that we have a Scofield Bible because he had a lot of notes and stuff in there. And he would basically take the scriptures and put his own interpretation in it. And his interpretation was, at least on the book of Revelation, futurism and dispensationalism rather than church historic. Okay? Now, there's also Clarence Larkin. He was born in 1850 and died in 1924. He was an American Baptist pastor, Bible teacher, and author whose writings on dispensationalism had a great impact on conservative Protestant visual culture in the 20th century. His intricate and influential charts provided readers with a visual strategy for mapping God's action in history and for interpreting really complex biblical prophecies. He made large wall prophetical charts which he titled Prophetic Truth, and they were for use in the pulpit. He used Scofield's dating system as his basis for his charge. his charts. In 1918, he completed the book titled Dispensational Truth, but high demand for the work led him to produce a greatly expanded edition of this book in 1920. Again, dates that we should take note of. So there was a lot that was happening here early on in the 20s. There was dispensationalism was getting a placehold within the fundamental church, or those churches that are not mainstream. And people were starting to focus a little more on teachings like the rapture, the millennium, all these dispensational teachings. And so they became very popularized in part by these two men right here. Here's a picture of Larkin's chart. And I know you can't see the details here, but you can find this chart on blueletterbible.org. It's there as one of the charts, and I put the source on there for you so you can go back and take a look at it. There's a lot of these charts, and blueletterbible.org has a really good collection of them. But you can see this is a chart of the book of Revelation. It talks about the seven churches, the seals, the vials, the trumpets, the beast. Pretty much all of your series are portrayed in this particular chart. Okay, now we're getting to what I consider to be the good stuff, and we're 25 minutes into this presentation. That's why I told you it's going to be a little longer. So a few years ago, back in 2019, I made a trip to Hickory, North Carolina, in my endeavors to do research on a man by the name of Walter S. Goodnight. I had heard about Goodnight growing up. I heard that he was the first seven seal preacher, that he was the person that came up with the concept, and so I wanted to know more about him. So I literally went down there. I visited his grave. It's a picture of me there standing in front of his grave. Actually, I cleaned his grave off. He didn't have any children, and it was full of moss and everything else. So myself and a friend, we ended up cleaning it up real nice. And that's a picture of him over on the right-hand side with his wife sitting there in front of him. So I actually met with some of his relatives, sat down and talked to them. His aunt was really up. I believe, his aunt was up in years. And I talked to her, and it was just, we had a great time. We had a great time. She told me a lot of things about him and his life, and so I wanted to share some of that with you today. A little bit about the man, and then some of the things that he taught. So Walter Sanford, or as so many of others of our Church of God pioneers he went by his initials, W.S. Goodnight. And his wife's name was Nora B. Boggs. Let's start with her first. She was a little older than him by a few years. She was born in 1874. She lived in North Carolina. She died in 1951, so she died before he did, also down in North Carolina. And she married Brother Goodnight in 1900. They had no children. Brother Goodnight himself, is Walter, as it were, he was born in 1878, also lived in North Carolina, died in North Carolina, in Morganton, North Carolina in 1953, a couple years after his wife did. His occupation was a shoemaker. So he was in the business of saving souls. in two different manners. He was a pastor. He was an evangelist. He was an author. He was converted in 1911 at the age of 33. Now, his whole family, including the lady I spoke to, I believe was his aunt, they were all Methodist. In fact, there was a little country Methodist church down there where the Goodnights were buried, except for Brother W.S. Goodnight. He didn't want to be buried in the Methodist church, so he was buried in the in the public cemetery. So here's what's interesting. He's listed in the yearbook, the Church of God yearbook, from 1930 through 1947. Okay? With 2 years of the exception, 1941 and 1946, which was most likely when he may have been traveling and did not get his card in that they had to renew every year. So he's listed starting in 1930. Okay? And he stayed associated with the Anderson movement until at least 1946. Okay, he was out in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a short period of time in 1942, and actually that's when he was working with an artist to paint his chart. And so he was out there for a while. He pastored in Boone, North Carolina from 1930 to 1943, so about 13 years. And then he also pastored for a short period of time in Rich Creek, Virginia. And that was, again, 1945 or about 1940, starting in 1944 and going through about 1945. Okay, so let me just read to you some information. You can find these quotes in some of his books and books that describe him and his life. So in 1928, he was the first Church of God minister to use a large oil-painted chart diagram, 35 feet in length, that covered 3,000 years of time. It was said that he had a gifting to make the Revelation message, quote, plain and simple, unquote. During his ministry, he authored many tracts and publications on the book of Revelation. W.S. Goodnight began presenting his thoughts to various ministers, beginning at state camp meetings in North Carolina and Virginia, and then to, quote unquote, a number of states. Now, here is a chart here that's in one of his books. I've just covered it with the word sample for the time being. This isn't a really clear copy. But, you know, you see some dates across the top. You start over in 1491 BC. Kind of covers the things we've talked about and shown on some of the other charts. Has BC 490 at the top, and then from there on, it starts going into the church ages. So, and more specifically, the 7 church ages. And then along the bottom, it also has some additional dates, 364, 606, you know, and so forth. Now, if you look across the top, you'll see some familiar dates that we've already talked about. You'll see the beginning, or Pentecost, the year of Pentecost, the founding or the birth of the church in AD 33. And then you'll see 270. But you'll begin to see a new one. There's 530. That wasn't on the what we'll call the 6 seal charts. And then there's AD 1530. And then there's AD 1730. AD 1880, we've seen that before. Then we see 1930. And as you notice, 1930 then is placed at the opening of the 7th church age. And then there's another date on here that is AD 1980. Okay, now we're going to talk about that date. So there's some new dates on there, but some dates that we've already seen in our study. In 1930, I put that in bold, W.S. Goodnight wrote a small pamphlet on the Revelation containing a chart outline of the seals, trumpets, and vials. And he mailed a copy to a number of the ministers of the Church of God in the United States for their consideration. A good number gave the pamphlet some study, while others cast it aside without considering it. As a minister, he traveled primarily through the South and Southwest, lecturing in some 25 states and proclaiming the message of the opening of the 7th seal church age. He usually conducted a 2-hour seminar on the importance of the church. Here is the first book that he published in 1933. So this is an additional to the pamphlets and so forth of the earlier ones, I think in 1928, 1930. So this is a more detailed version of those pamphlets, that information. This was published in 1933, and it's titled Chart Explanation of the Revelation with the Opening of the Last Seal. Okay, now this book was published by the author by Warner Press in Anderson, Indiana, although the contents were not endorsed by the Church of God leadership, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So this is a copy of the book. Now, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you obtain a copy of this book. This is the foundation of the Seventh Seal message. This is the first book by the brother that first preached the Seventh Seal. Some of us may not even know about this book or never even seen it. Myself, I was one of those. But I traced it down and I found it. And so I really encourage you to try to find a copy of this book. If you cannot, feel free to send me an email, and I will email to you a digital copy of this book. It is available online, and there are sites out there that have had this. That's where I found my digital copy. I did not scan this whole book. So you should be able to just Google it and go out there and find it as a PDF file or something like that. But if you don't, if you send me an email and you ask nicely, I will send you a copy of this book. Be happy to. Because it's important that we understand our foundation. If our foundation is not sure what's the scriptures say, it's not going to stand. So we need to understand what this message that we call the Seventh Seal, where it got started, how it got started, who started it, and what it was all about. Okay? Now, our last two episodes, I spent a long time talking about some of the issues that were transpiring and had been transpiring for some time within the Church of God Reformation movement. There were things that were unsettled. There was, the list is long. You saw those. There's other things that's out there that I did not discuss. And if you remember early on, I said it depends on who you ask what their particular issue was. There was a whole list of them. And so, so the overall atmosphere at this time was, what do? We've lost our way. This is not what the Church of God used to be. All these changes, they're concerning, they're alarming. Some of them were doctrinal, some of them were, on the practical level, some of them were prophetic. There's all kinds of things. There were failed prophecies. They didn't, a lot of issues that were out there, and they felt like the church that they've come to know and understand and love was going down. And so that atmosphere created this overall excitement for something new, another movement. Okay? So this is a chart that's in that book there. This is a line chart, I call it. It doesn't have nice pictures on it. But you can see it's pretty much what we've already been talking about. You see on here, and all of it, by the way, is explained at the bottom there, the references. So it shows the figures, and if you match up the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the ABCs and the 1A, if you match all those up with the little numbers throughout the chart, it actually gives you a breakdown of where his understanding was at with regard to where these things fit in the overall picture of Revelation. So this was the first diagram of the seventh seal. And you can see across the top, there's your dates, 270, 530. Now we got 1530. We've got 1880. And then at the far right, we've got 1980. And then we got this little thing to the right of that called the Camp of the Saints. All that is explained in his book, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in our lesson today. So if you go to the middle there, you see Papal Rome represented, the Catholic Church. You see Protestantism, You see expression to rivers and fountains of the water, the vial, in other words, that was poured out. False prophets. So, you see it all. You see pretty much the things that we're accustomed to seeing, but in this case, it's in word form. And then starting in 1880, you see the Church of God, and then 1980, the Camp of the Saints. Let me just give you a few selected highlights. Again, I'm only giving you little snippets of information. I want you to read this book for yourself. I want you to get a copy of this and read it. I'm just sharing some of the things that, as I was going through it, that I thought was interesting. So highlights. So let's go ahead and read some of those. W.S. Goodnight strongly believed that the Church of God Anderson movement was fallen and had apostatized. He called for another reformation, primarily within the church. He stated that the seventh trumpet was beginning to loudly sound and the opening of the seventh seal had taken place in 1930, the year he wrote his small pamphlet on the Revelation. So this is just something that I'm highlighting there. So he had the year 1930, and if you remember from our previous podcast, there were some changes that took place in 1930. For instance, F.G. Smith got voted out. C.E. Brown got voted in as the editor. I think that's the year they changed the name from Gospel Trumpet Company to Warner Press. So there's some other changes that took place, in a visual way, so to speak. And it's also the year that he put his book out, his little pamphlet book, and sent it out to all those brethren. So he's using 1930, and he's using the year he sent that out, as well as these other events, as the opening of the seventh seal. Now, through a mathematical calculation, which we'll show later on, he claimed that the seventh seal church age would come to an end in 1980, and that no one in the world would be saved after December 1st, 1980. No one in Catholicism or Protestant would be saved after 1980, nor in the Church of God, as all would have been, or they would have been called out into this one unified body. So he believed, let me summarize that for you. He believed that by the end of 1980, the people would be gathered into one visible body. Okay? No one in Catholicism or Protestantism would be saved because all the Christians that were in those organizations would have been called out and called to the Church of God. He firmly believed that by 1980, all the saved and sanctified people would be gathered into one organized and visible church, followed by the camp of the saints. He further claimed that communism, or he referred to it throughout his book, either as communism or atheism, would come against Babylon, which was, in his view, all false churches, and these communist people would kill them, as well as some of the saints of the Church of God. He believed that Jesus would return in around June of 1983, which was 3.5 years after the closing of the seventh seal. Okay? And he compared those 3.5 years to like Daniel's 70th week, how that the Messiah would come in the midst of that middle of that week. So he was saying here that the second coming of Christ was going to be sometime after 1980, when the seventh seal would have closed, and it would happen about in the middle of this prophetic time period of 3.5 years. And so it was going to be around the middle of 1983. Further, he stated that only people who had been both saved and sanctified, in other words, having experienced two works of grace, only they would go to heaven at Jesus' return. He stated that people who had only been saved, or in other words, experienced the first work of grace, but had not been sanctified at the time of Christ's coming, those people, although they were saved and justified, they were included with the ungodly and would be thrown into hell with other unbelievers. So that's some pretty radical beliefs there. Pretty radical beliefs. So born again, being born again of the Spirit of God, you would not be saved at Christ's coming unless you had gone on and received the second work of grace. Now, that's not taught today in any of the groups, but that's what he believed. I don't even think the sixth seal taught that. Okay, let's make some more observations. And this is worthy of some further examination. I've looked into it. I haven't been able to find anything like this, but it's possible that there may be some connection. He said that the Prophet Muhammad had the word, or in other words, he had the scripture, and must have been a star in the church at one time. So at one point he was a Christian. He was a minister. But he fell, giving heed to seducing spirits and devils of doctrines, and transformed himself he was transformed into an angel of light. I have never been able to find any evidence of Muhammad being a minister in a Christian church. Possibly, if there's anybody out there that wants to do some research and send that to me, I would greatly appreciate that. Okay, another thing he said is, so this angel, and he's referring to Revelation 16, verse 8 and 9, starts the fourth vial in the pouring out of the word beginning in the year 1928. Well, where did he get 1928? He actually says in there, he says, at this time I began this study with this line of thought and will continue to pour out till the end. So basically he was saying that at this time he himself found himself in prophecy. Because otherwise there's really nothing significant about 1928. So he specifically tells us that this particular vial was poured out by this angel in 1928, and that, oh, by the way, that's the year that I started working on this study. Well, we kind of seen that before, didn't we? In the year 1880, the year that Brother Warner put out his first book. Okay, last observation on this chart. There has been a tendency to compromise in working together in meetings with sect preachers, inviting them to preach or fill pulpits in some places of the Church of God. Back in the beginning of the Reformation, when Babylon was getting her first cup filled, nothing like this took place. Judgment was poured out in its fullness. Okay, and this was a great concern to him, because he was basically saying, within the Church of God Reformation movement, with general offices in Anderson, again, they don't call them headquarters, he said back in those early days, the people that filled the pulpits, they were not anybody but Church of God folks. But we're seeing change take place. Okay, I told you early on that this study is not about the symbols, and it is not. There are other individuals out there that have spent, in some cases, their lives defining what these symbols are. I just wanted to give you a sampling of what Brother Goodnight was saying in his book regarding a few of the symbols. So the first one is the earthquake. He says, following the seventh vial, there is a great earthquake spoken of, such as was not since man has been upon the earth, so mighty and so great. The morning truth going forth caused an earthquake, as previously mentioned. In AD 1880, in that Reformation, the bringing back of light with regard to the church divine caused an earthquake. So that's the second earthquake. Now in the pouring out of the seventh seal vials, we have the greatest of all earthquakes, with hail following, the weight of a talent. That's on page 107. So Brother Goodnight here wrote this book in AD 33 and was saying that sometime, or not, I'm so sorry. He wrote this book in 1933, not AD 33, 1933. He was basically saying that from that point, 1930 until 1980, there was going to be a third earthquake. Okay, so my question is, when did that happen? It's an earthquake such that they've never seen anything like it before. It was going to be the greatest of all earthquakes, greater than what we read about in the New Testament, greater than what we read about in the sixth seal. Where is that earthquake? When did it happen? If any of you know, I would like to, I'd like for you to share that with me. I know there are people out there that claim to have stated in some of the seven seal groups that has already taken place. There are some that are now rethinking that, or saying, well, it's yet to happen in the future. Okay, just something to think about. Okay, his explanation of the eighth beast. So, the denominational churches that existed before that time, and this is his words here, that existed for that time, or in 1880, so before the sixth seal, he said they make up the beast, or rather, all that will unite in the federation of churches as now working together with Protestantism and Papal Rome. So he believed that these beasts that we read about, specifically the one that came out of the sea and the one that came out of the earth, one representing paganism and one representing Protestantism, he believed that all those churches, as well as any churches that would join in some kind of federation of churches, are going to be working together. Okay, they're going to be working together. Since that time, since the Federation of Churches, which was actually, it actually was an organization back in his day, in fact, they evolved into the National Council of Church in North America, and then also, since that time, there's been something that's called the World Council of Churches. So there has been a conglomeration, I don't like to use that word, but you understand what I'm saying, of churches coming together for, the common good of their time, their days. That's how they view it. He believed the eighth beast was going to be the federation of churches that will eventually unite in the seven seal age, forming one of the divisions advocating the doctrine of evolution. So he brought in evolution associated with this conglomeration of churches. He said the second part of that is the dragon powers, as in Russia, forming one advocating atheism. And again, there was a lot of things going on back in those days. Yes, there were church organizations coming together. Yes, there was communism. Yes, communism was a bad thing and still is. And communism didn't believe in God. So yes, they were atheistic. He believed that Russia and the powers that be that were advocating communism or atheism was going to unite with all these churches. And the third part of that was the false holiness movements, the holiness movement that he had been part of, that he left. He believed they were represented by the beast, the horns on the beast of chapter 17, and they will form the other division, refusing to come to the fullness of the truth. They were, in other words, they did not accept the message of come out of her, these holiness people, and so they were a third part of this eighth beast. Thus they will be divided in three parts, and all will unite in the end, making up the eighth beast. Okay? So if you remember on our previous chart there, the Camp of the Saints, he had this little section called the Camp of the Saints. So he believed that as of the end of 1980, no one else was going to be saved. The door was going to be shut, like in the ark. The door was, mercy was going to be shut. No one's going to be saved. And then this conglomeration of these three groups were going to come against the Church of God, surround her in this Camp of the Saints, and just as they were getting ready to take over and do much damage, Jesus was going to come back. That's how he basically interpreted the eighth beast and the Camp of the Saints. Now, I told you, I'm going to stop right here. I think this is probably a good place for me to expand a little bit. So I was born in 1962. And I graduated from high school in 1980. I had heard all of the stuff about 1980 growing up. It was on the charts. There would be explanations that were given of it. Now this is, 30 some years after the fact, when I was born. So it's 60 some years, or 50 some years since this prophecy had come into being. So I had it in my mind that, I'm graduating in June of 1980. They had no sense of getting a job, a decent job. I'll just get by for the next few months. I had no ambition of going to college. I had no ambition of getting married, having a family, buying a house. I didn't have any ambition to do any of that stuff because what was the point? Jesus was coming back. So I felt like it would be best, to be focused on doing things in preparation for that. And so that's what I did. I'll Now, we didn't understand the Camp of the Saints piece of this thing. All we knew was we saw 1980 on that chart, and that was that we heard people talk about Jesus is coming back, and we don't know when, but we think it's somewhere around 1980. And so I had it in my mind. I remember when 1980 came, and this was, I don't know if I've shared this on these episodes or not, but I remember, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, we get to December of 1980. And I'm like, wow, he hasn't come back. He could be back anytime. And I believed that. And I remember that December 31st, 1980, I remember went to a friend's house and they had a television and we were watching the ball come down, there in New York. Central Park, I think it is, or down the area. And I remember, wow, here it goes. I'm sitting there wondering the whole time it's dropping if Jesus is coming back. I thought he was going to come back. And then it went into January the 1st, 1981. He wasn't here. It never even dawned on me that on the other side of the world, they had already been in 1981, because their time was different than ours. And so at that point, it was like, whoa. Then that's when I started thinking, well, maybe I should plan on getting a job. Maybe I should, go to college. Maybe I should do this, do that, And so I started making plans beyond that. But up until that point, that's what I thought was going to happen. And I heard that in messages. I've seen diagrams of it. I've seen there's a little pamphlet called God's Time Clock, and it's got it on there too. And so what really has... Now, Brother Goodnight, he died. We talked about when he died. He died in the 50s. He never saw any of this happen. He didn't have a chance to go back and make any corrections. He was dead. Same thing with Brother Warner. He died before 1941 or thereabouts. He didn't have a chance to make any corrections. He didn't have a chance to make any corrections about 1896, that being a prophetic year and some big event was going to happen there. But there were people that were preaching this, and preaching it pretty strong in the Seven Seal movement, that when it came and went, I never heard anybody get up and apologize and say, wow, I am so sorry. I got this wrong. I read this book. I got this from this book and not the Lord. I never heard anybody say that. It was just kind of swept under the carpet. We just moved on. If anyone knows of individuals that did apologize for spreading this, even in their well intentions, I would like to know about that. It would make me feel better about it, to be honest. I would feel better about it. But whenever people make these prophecies and set these dates and they come and go and nothing happens and nothing's said about it, at least the Adventists came up with an alternate explanation. They still got that wrong, but they came up with something to try to fix it. In Church of God, nothing was ever said. So that still bothers me to this very day. So we'll move on. Okay, another thing that Brother Goodnight talked about was the vials, and he had the vials. 3 of them, he believed, were poured out in the 6th seal, and then the last 4 were poured out in the 7th seal. And so these were only in the last two seals, if it were the last 2 epochs of time. And he had an explanation for those, including the radio vial, and a vial that was to be poured out on heathen nations, and so forth, the traditional things. The first vial, he said, was being poured out on religious institutions and things like secret lodges that were part of Protestantism and even Papal Rome. So there was just a lot of things in there. People do not teach this stuff today. They do teach the pouring out of the vials, but they do not now teach the way Goodnight taught when he first came up with this. But remember, he and Brother Warner would go around making these judgments about people that didn't accept their message, when now even people that follow them and have great regard for them don't even accept their message on some of these lines. So it's really, we have to be very careful about those kind of things. This whole thing about date setting, it really bothers me anyways. Scripture is very clear. We don't know the time. We don't know the year. We don't know when Jesus is coming back. He don't even know. If he don't know, how are we going to figure it out? So we need to be very, very careful when we're talking about trying to say that God's teaching this in his prophetic word, and then it doesn't happen. It's just not good. Okay, another symbol, and this is something that I want to spend a little bit of time on. A teaching that he had called the preliminary judgment, or the day symbol. So in Revelation 6:17, it says this: "For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" Now, in that day was supposed to represent, in Brother Goodnight's understanding, the 6th seal and the 7th seal combined. This combination of two church ages consisting of preliminary judgment. That judgment was being poured out against Mystery Babylon and all the Protestants and the Catholics. And there's another point I really didn't mean to make right now, but there's very little discussion about the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church is bigger than the Protestant Church, but yet it doesn't have a symbol, and there's not a whole lot of preaching on the Orthodox Church. But nonetheless, this day was supposed to represent these 2 church ages. Okay? And then he also went back and referred to, let me just read it here. In this, we have the day symbol, just as we had the 10 days in the dark period, also in the 3 1/2 days, the Protestant period. And in both of those cases, both of those symbols of the day, he believed that they represented 100 years. So the 10 days of the Dark Ages was really 1,000 years, because each day represented 100 years. Using that way of calculating things, he said that there was going to be 100 years of preliminary judgment from 1880 until 1980. There's how you got the 1980 right there. Okay? And so, since he believed that there was 100 years during this time, and the sixth seal started in 1880 and went to 1930, that's 50 years. So he believed the seventh seal then was going to last 50 years as well, because there's only 100 years of preliminary judgment. So that's how he came up with 1980. And then they would also use the expression about Babylon getting her second cup. Well, they would say, well, Babylon, the vial was poured out on Babylon. The first cup was for 50 years under the sixth seal. So now the second cup is under the seventh seal, and that's another 50 years. So those two things combined led them to believe that 1980 was going to be the end of the seventh time period. And at that point, Jesus could pretty much come back at any time. Okay? So that's how we got the 1980 on the chart. That was the rationale behind it. All right, the heavenly Jerusalem. This is found in Revelation, the 4th chapter, 1 through 11, and chapters 21. Goodnight believed that these scriptures, and also chapter 22, were to take place over in heaven after Christ returned the second time. You can find this on pages 133 and 137. Behold, a door is open in heaven, he said, the throne of God. This chapter, studied in this light just after the seven churches, is easily seen to be taking place after time is ended here in the earth, with all nations gathered around the throne of God on the sea of glass. So it was seen by John in heaven as on earth. He believed that the new heaven and new earth, there's things like the streets of gold and no sun or moon to shine. He said, thus we get a glimpse of things in chapters 21 and 22 as referring to things spiritual in the beyond. So rather than seeing New Jerusalem as a symbol of the church coming down from heaven, he saw those events in Revelation as something that took place over in heaven. That's very similar to some of the sixth seal teaching, in which they say that the events of the seventh seal were events that took place over in heaven. So again, just an example of where today among the seventh seal advocates, they look back on some of these things in the sixth seal and they'll say, well, we have more light. And so they change the symbols. Okay, now here's what I've been talking about, this rejection. Let me read a quote here from Brother Goodnight, found on page 90, and rejecting the seventh seal message and the fallen stars. Here's what he said. This will take ministers with this reform that refuse to move to the light of the seventh seal and still contend to hold to light as received by the former teachers of the sixth seal, rejecting advanced light. The stars fell, it appears, in one mighty rush to the amount of 1/3. The ministry in the church at Sardis as seen as dead, generally speaking. So we are not to think this falling means altogether in Protestantism. There are ministers with sixth seal reform, satisfied, sitting down on truth, rich, thinking that there is no more light for us. May God help us to see the danger of standing still in the light. We cannot stand still. If we fail to advance, we shall begin to compromise and go back to the powers of dragon, back to the dragon powers.